activity during periods of depression or during periods of other type of disorders as OCD, schizophrenia, bipolar depression. Neurotransmitters, we have several neurotransmitters. One of the most important ones are the ones derived from the monoamine families. So we have the catecholamines, where in the catecholamines group we have the dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. In the endolamines group, we have serotonin and melatonin. And in the group of trinoaminergic neurotransmitter system, we have the norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin 5-HT. GABA and glycine are also neurotransmitters, but in this case, they're called inhibitors. So, a neurotransmitter can be excitatory or inhibitory, um, and it depends of the action that they produce over the postsynaptic neuron. So inhibitory postsynaptic protection decreases firing, and propagation of the action potential. In the case of GABA, has to do with the chloride ion influx. GABAergic synapses are inhibitory, and glycine synapses are also inhibitory, and both of them they have to do with chloride ion influx. GABA butyric acid and glycine um, uh, are inhibitory neurotransmitters that account for 40% of the inhibitory process in the brain. Uh, the main one is GABA, and in the spinal cord, the main one is glycine. Glutamate, it, on the other hand, is an excitatory neurotransmitter. It's the main excitatory neurotransmitter of the brain. Acetylcholine is very important. I think it's the most important neurotransmitter used throughout the body. It is present in the neuromuscular junction, and it's also present in the autonomic nervous system, and both on the parasympathetic and sympathetic. In the brain, it is responsible for arousal, attention, memory, and motivation. There are several different acetylcholine receptor types. There are several muscarinic and there are several nicotinic, but mainly general muscarinic and nicotinic. So, on the muscarinic neurotransmitters receptors, all of them are G protein type receptors. They're all G protein type receptors. We have M1 present in the central nervous system that is involved with perception, attention, and cognition, right? So, some of the antipsychotics and antidepressants are going to have action over M1 acetylcholine receptor. They're going to antagonize the postsynaptic M1 receptors. M2 is also present in the brain, but also in the heart. So M2 is going to be responsible for reduction of the heart rate or the rhythm. Then we have M3, M4, and 5. M3 is also present in the smooth muscles and also in the salivary glands. So it's going to be responsible for bronchoconstrictions in the lungs, bladder voiding, and contraction of also of the smooth muscles in the smooth muscles. Mm, M4 and M5 less important. Norepinephrine, also a monoamine, is synthesized in the nervous system, and it's present norepinephrine in the sympathetic nerves. The locus coeruleus, remember that we talked about that, plays a vital role in the signaling of norepinephrine, especially on the pathway that goes to the cortex. The release of norepinephrine in the brain exerts a lot of mm, functions: stress, sleep, attention, focus, and inflammation. It also regulates the responses of the autonomic nervous system. Histamine has to do with wakefulness, feeding behavior, controls of motivational behavior. Dopamine. Dopamine after acetylcholine is the other most important neurotransmitter. It's essential for learning, for motor control, rewards, emotion, and executive functions. Remember, dopamine are very low in Parkinson's disease. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Dopamine is also implicated in other disorders like Huntington, depression, schizophrenia. So their receptor type for dopamine is T2, is also a G protein couple. And we have partial agonism like aripiprazole that can create antipsychotic effects. And we also have antagonism, that's typical or atypical antipsychotics that create an antipsychotic effect. Serotonin, the third most important neurotransmitter, we have different receptors, approximately 7, but I think they discover more. They're present in the central nervous system, mainly found in the midline RAF nuclei. It's located in the brainstem, also in the midbrain to the medulla. Uh, the functions of serotonin are wakefulness, like histamine, affective behavior, food intake, thermoregulation, migraines, and messy sexual behavior. Um, Also, the neurons that are present in serotonin in the RAF has to do with the regulation of pain nociception and motor tone. And in the periphery, serotonin regulates the vascular tone and the gastrointestinal motility. So, serotonin is produced in the presynaptic nerve ending. It comes from tryptophan and it is incorporated in vesicles. Um, it could be released by the function of the vesicle with the presynaptic membrane into the synaptic cleft. And then serotonin binds to the postsynaptic receptors in order to produce the neurotransmission and the effect, right? The function. But then serotonin needs to be reuptake. That's the next step through a receptor. Okay, so that receptor is located in the presynaptic neuron, and it reuptakes all the leftover of serotonin in the cleft, and it's reused again. But in the case of the use of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, this receptor is blocked, so serotonin will stay a little bit longer in the synaptic cleft, and the action of serotonin will be uh, longer. Um, you will see the action longer because more number of molecules of serotonin will interact with the receptors in the postsynaptic. So also uh, the receptors type for serotonin are protein G protein coupled receptor type. We have 5-HT1 receptor, which agonist is mirtazapine, that has an antidepressant effect. We have a 5-HT1A, uh, which the medication that is agonist is called buspirone, that has an anti-anxiety effect, and also aripiprazole also is an antidepressant action over this receptor. Uh, 5-HT2A, um, we have a selective serotonin release uptake inhibitor that the agonist effect will be sexual dysfunction, insomnia, and anxiety. So, the ones that affect the 5-HT2A antagonism can be used for mood stabilizing antidepressant action in bipolar disorder or as a typical antipsychotic. For the reduction of sexual dysfunction, we have trazodone, aripiprazole, and cyproheptadine. For the reduction of motor side effects from a serotonin syndrome, the antagonist of this receptor, we got cyproheptadine, and antagonist of H5HT2A is also mirtazapine, that has an antidepressant effect. So, as that same one, mirtazapine is also an antagonist of 5-HT2C. As you see, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors uh, or antagonists can have different effects depending on where the receptor type target. Acetylcholine, when it starts, is action potential. Uh, when the action potential arrives to the axon terminal here, what that happens is that the voltage gated calcium channels open and the calcium enters, right? That calcium will signals to the vesicle, which has inside the acetylcholine. So in the case of excitatory neurotransmitter, the ion is calcium. The vesicles will move to the membrane, and the docked vesicles will release by exocytosis the neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. Neurotransmitter will get bound to the postsynaptic receptors on the postsynaptic axon, and that will allow the ligand gated sodium ion in the postsynaptic membrane. So, postsynaptic membrane uses sodium. Presynaptic uh, mm, uh, axon uses calcium. Neurotransmitters changes within each one of the different type of disorders. In Alzheimer's disease, we have low levels of acetylcholine, but we have high levels of glutamate, excitatory neurotransmitter. In anxiety disorders, usually they have to do with serotonin, low levels of serotonin, and high levels of norepinephrine sometimes, and low levels of GABA. In schizophrenia, the most important neurotransmitter is in excess of dopamine. In depression, everything is down: dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. Huntington disease, we have high levels of dopamine, we have low levels of acetylcholine, and low levels of GABA. In Parkinson's disease, because we have a destruction of the nigrostriatal pathway, we have low levels of dopamine produced by substantia nigra, and we have low levels of serotonin, high levels or excess of acetylcholine in the case of Parkinson's disease. That's why they have those movements. Okay. I don't pretend that you learned this. I just want to make sense of the opposite effects of dopamine and serotonin, explaining you a little bit about the pathways. So, in the case of dopamine pathways, in this side of the figure, they are going to start in on the nigrostriatal pathway or on the ventral tegmental area, right? And they're going to project to the sensory motor cortex or network, or to the default mode in color green network. But they start here in the substantia nigra and in the ventral tegmental area. That's the dopamine pathways. So the sensory motor network is the one that we move our limbs, right? We move our muscles. The default mode network has to do when we have our thinking, our thoughts, we're not thinking in anything, is like the resting stage. Okay. In the case of the serotonin pathways, they will start in the RAF nuclei in color red, and they're going to go from there, the main projections, to the other parts for the sensory networks in color blue, and to the default mode network. Okay, so that's the difference uh, of the nuclear projections and the resting state networks between dopamine and serotonin. So they are going to have opposite functions. So there is an hypothesis on the functional reorganization and resting state network disbalancing that mediated by alterations of neurotransmitters signaling in different psychopathological states. I don't pretend that you learned this. I just want to make sense about how this works. So when we have a patient that has a maniac state, the levels of serotonin are going to be low, and the manifestation is going to be psychomotor excitation, and it's going to be focused on external focus thought. That's a manic state, and it has to do with low serotonin. The depressive state, this is an hypothesis, okay, has to do with low levels of dopamine, and that manifestation is going to be a psychomotor inhibition and an internal focus thought. That's the depressive state. Remember, I'm talking about states. I'm not talking about disorders. We can have depressive states in different disorders. We can have manic states in different disorders. And then I have the psychotic states, where it's going to be characterized by high levels of dopamine, and the patient is going to present psychomotor agitation, perceptual distortions like hallucinations, delusions, and thought disturbances. Okay? And that has to do with high levels of dopamine. So, this slide has to do with this one. So, when I have high levels of dopamine, the patient is going to have psychotic stage, When I have low levels of dopamine, the patient is going to have depression. When I have low levels of serotonin, patient can have a manic state. The dopamine pathways are very important that you learn them, each one of them. We have the nigrostriatal pathway in color red. It goes from the substancia nigra. It produces, it works with dopamine, of course, and it goes to the stratum. This nigrostriatal pathway is the one that it's not working well with low levels of dopamine in patients with Parkinson. The mesolimbic pathway also starts in the ventral tegmental area, and from there it goes to the nucleo accumbens. This mesolimbic pathway, we're going to talk about this. It's one of the rewards pathways, and from the ventral tegmental area in color blue, and it goes to the prefrontal cortex. That is going to be called the mesocortical pathways. Also, we have another one that's a neuroendocrine pathway. Um, it is not represented here. Well, this is everything for day 0.